February 19, 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Dawn broke cold over the desert mountains, painting the rocky slopes in shades of copper and shadow. In a narrow ravine 3 miles east of the pass, a young American combat engineer named Lieutenant Daniel Marsh knelt in the sand beside a wooden ammunition crate. His hands were steady despite the cold. Inside the crate were 12 bombs, not dropped from aircraft, not fired from artillery. These were bombs that would never leave the ground. Bombs designed to wait in silence beneath the earth until the weight of a German tank pressed down upon them. Behind Marsh, his squad worked in frantic silence, shoveling sand and stone, burying identical crates along a quarter-mile stretch of road. They had 6 hours before Rommel's panzers arrived. 6 hours to turn a desert highway into a killing ground using a tactic so new that half the American high command thought it was suicide. What happened in those next 6 hours would not stop the German breakthrough at Kasserine, but it would buy enough time for thousands of American soldiers to escape encirclement. And it would prove that even in defeat, American ingenuity could turn the tide of a single desperate morning. Stay with this story, because what these engineers buried in the sand was more than explosives. It was the beginning of America's education in modern warfare, and the lesson would be written in fire and shattered steel. Kasserine Pass was where America learned to bleed. It was the first major engagement between American and German forces in World War II. It was a disaster. For 3 days in mid-February 1943, elements of Rommel's Afrika Korps smashed through inexperienced American units with a speed and violence that shocked Allied commanders. Entire battalions disintegrated. Equipment was abandoned. Men who had trained for months in the safety of American camps found themselves facing the most battle-hardened army in the world. And they were not ready. The Afrika Korps was a legend before it ever met the Americans. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had built his reputation fighting the British across Libya and Egypt. His panzer tactics were studied in every military academy. His ability to maneuver armor across impossible terrain had made him a hero in Germany and a nightmare for the Allies. When he turned his attention to the American positions in Tunisia, he expected quick victory. His intelligence reports told him the Americans were green, poorly led, over-reliant on equipment, and undertrained in combat. He believed that one sharp blow would shatter their morale and send them retreating back to Algeria. He was almost right. On February 14th, German and Italian forces attacked through the Fayed Pass. American armor was outmaneuvered and destroyed. Infantry units were overrun. Within 48 hours, Rommel's forces had broken through the initial defensive lines and were racing toward Kasserine Pass itself. If they could seize the pass, they would have a direct route to the Allied supply depots at Tebessa. The entire American position in Tunisia would collapse. Rommel could roll up the flank of the British 8th Army and potentially drive the Allies out of North Africa altogether. But Rommel did not know about Lieutenant Marsh. He did not know about the 12 crates of buried bombs. And he did not know that American combat engineers, facing their first real test of the war, were about to write a different ending to the story of February 19th. Daniel Marsh was 25 years old. He was from a town called Butte, Montana, where his father had worked in the copper mines. Marsh had studied civil engineering at the State University before the war. He understood geology. He understood explosives. He understood how to move earth and stone to build roads and bridges. When the Army made him an officer and put him in command of an engineer platoon, he thought he would be building things. Instead, he found himself in North Africa with orders to destroy them. The American retreat from the Fayed Pass had been chaos. Units were scattered. Communications were broken. Officers struggled to regroup their men and establish defensive positions. But amid the confusion, Marsh's platoon had received a specific mission from a colonel whose name he never learned. The colonel's orders were simple and terrifying. Hold the road east of Kasserine for 6 hours. Give the retreating infantry time to fall back through the pass. Use whatever means necessary. Marsh looked at his 37 men. He looked at the trucks loaded with engineering equipment. And he looked at the crates of Mark the Satutridiu, quickened anti-tank mines that had been delivered 2 weeks earlier but never deployed because no one had trained the platoon on how to use them properly. The mines were British-designed, pressure-activated. Each one contained 10 pounds of high explosive. They were meant to be buried in defensive minefields with proper spacing and marking, but there was no time for proper procedure. There was no time for training. There was barely time to think. Marsh made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed under normal circumstances. He ordered his men to bury the mines in clusters. 3 or 4 mines wired together in a single hole, spaced every 20 yards along the road where intelligence said the German armor would advance. The idea was to create not a minefield, but a series of explosive traps powerful enough to destroy a tank outright, rather than just disable it. It violated every engineering manual. It was wasteful, dangerous to install. But Marsh calculated that shock value mattered more than efficiency. If the Germans hit one of these clusters and lost a tank in a massive explosion, it might make them cautious, might slow their advance, might buy the hours his orders demanded. His men thought he was insane, but they dug anyway. The work was brutal. The desert floor looked soft, but was actually a mix of sand over hardpan rock. Every hole had to be at least 18 inches deep to hide the mines from visual inspection. The men used shovels and pickaxes. They worked in 2-man teams. One man dug, while the other kept watch on the eastern horizon for signs of German reconnaissance. The mines were heavy. Each crate held 6. The men carried them from the trucks to the holes, moving in a crouch to stay below the sight line of the low hills. Marsh supervised the wiring. The mines were designed to detonate individually when a tank's weight pressed on the pressure plate. But Marsh wanted simultaneous detonation. He used communications wire to link 3 mines together and rigged the center mine's pressure plate as the trigger. When it went off, the other 2 would detonate a fraction of a second later. The combined force would be equivalent to 30 pounds of high explosive erupting directly beneath a tank's belly armor. No tank in the German inventory could survive that. Not even a Tiger, except there were no Tigers in Tunisia yet. What Marsh was preparing to face were Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. Good tanks, fast and well-armored by 1943 standards, but vulnerable from below. Tank armor was thickest at the front and sides. The belly was the weak point. A mine strike there could rupture fuel tanks, detonate ammunition, or simply tear the vehicle apart. The blast would kill or maim the crew instantly. It was a horrific way to die. But Marsh did not allow himself to think about that. He thought only about the 6 hours, about the men retreating through the pass behind him, about the job. By 0800 hours, they had buried 16 clusters, 48 mines total. The road looked unchanged, just sand and stone and the tire tracks of American vehicles that had passed through during the retreat. Marsh walked the length of the trap zone and checked each burial site. The mines were invisible. Perfect. He marked their positions on a hand-drawn map and gave copies to his squad leaders. Then he ordered his men to fall back to positions in the rocks 500 yards west of the minefield. They had barely reached cover when the Germans appeared. The reconnaissance came first. 2 armored cars moving fast down the road, their commanders standing in the open hatches, scanning for obstacles. Marsh watched through binoculars from behind a boulder. His heart hammered in his chest. If the reconnaissance spotted the disturbed sand, if they stopped to investigate, the entire plan would collapse. But the armored cars did not stop. They raced past the minefield without slowing and disappeared around a bend in the road. 30 minutes later, the tanks came. There were 12 of them in the first wave. Panzer IVs mostly, with 2 Panzer IIIs in the lead. They moved in a loose column, spaced about 50 yards apart. Infantry followed on foot, using the tanks for cover. Marsh counted roughly 2 companies, maybe 300 men. Behind them, more dust clouds on the horizon suggested a larger force was following. This was the spearhead, the tip of Rommel's thrust toward Kasserine. Marsh whispered orders to his squad leaders. No one fires until the tanks hit the mines. No matter what happens, stay hidden. Let the explosives do the work. The men crouched lower behind their rocks and waited. The 1st Panzer IV reached the minefield at 8:47 hours. It rolled over the first cluster without triggering it. The mine's pressure plate required at least 300 pounds of direct weight. The tank's left tread missed the plate by inches. Marsh felt his stomach drop. If all the tanks missed the plates, if his burial depth was wrong, if the weight distribution was off, then the entire trap was useless. He clenched his fists and watched the second tank approach. This one did not miss. The explosion was nothing like Marsh had imagined. It was not a single blast, but a triple-hammered eruption that seemed to tear the air itself apart. The Panzer IV lifted off the ground. Flame and black smoke geysered upward. The turret separated from the hull and tumbled through the air like a thrown toy. The chassis crashed back to earth in a shower of burning debris. The tank behind it swerved and immediately hit another cluster. Another triple explosion. Another fireball. Within 10 seconds, 2 German tanks were burning wrecks, and the entire column had stopped. The German infantry scattered. Officers shouted orders. The remaining tanks reversed, trying to back away from the road. But the third tank in line, attempting to maneuver around the wreckage, triggered a third cluster. The blast flipped the tank onto its side. Ammunition cooked off inside the hull. The explosion was so violent that pieces of the tank landed 100 yards away. Marsh stared in shock. He had expected the mines to work. He had not expected this level of devastation. 3 tanks destroyed in less than a minute. The German column was paralyzed, and the infantry, realizing they were in a kill zone, began to retreat back down the road. But the battle was not over. It had barely begun. The Germans were professionals. They did not panic. Within 20 minutes, combat engineers arrived with mine detectors. They began sweeping the road in methodical patterns, searching for more explosives. Marsh watched them work and knew his trap had a limited lifespan. Once the Germans realized the mines were clustered, they would clear them systematically. His 6-hour mission was already down to 5, but Rommel's commanders were impatient. The delay was unacceptable. They could see Kasserine Pass in the distance. They could see the prize within reach. And they were not willing to wait for engineers to clear a road when there was open desert on either side. At 0930 hours, the German tanks moved off the road and began advancing cross-country, swinging wide to avoid the minefield. Marsh had anticipated this. He ordered his squads to open fire with everything they had. Machine guns, mortars, a single 37mm anti-tank gun they had somehow kept functional. The fire was not enough to stop the tanks, but it forced the German infantry to take cover. It slowed the advance. It turned what should have been a rapid breakthrough into a grinding, cautious fight. The anti-tank gun managed 3 shots before a German tank destroyed it. 1 shot missed. 1 bounced off frontal armor. But the third hit a Panzer III in the side and penetrated. The tank slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from the hatches. The crew bailed out and ran for cover. It was a small victory, but it was something. By 1100 hours, the Germans had pushed past Marsh's position. His platoon was in danger of being surrounded. He gave the order to fall back. The men moved in pairs, using the rocks for cover, firing and retreating in the disciplined withdrawal they had practiced 100 times in training, but never believed they would need. 2 men were hit by machine gun fire. 1 died instantly. The other was carried by his squad mates, bleeding from a leg wound, cursing and praying in equal measure. Marsh was the last to leave. He took one final look at the burning tanks on the road. Counted them. 5 confirmed kills. Maybe 6 if the damaged Panzer III was counted. Against a force 10 times their size, his 37 engineers had inflicted real damage. They had bought time. Not 6 hours, but close to 4. And 4 hours, it turned out, was enough. The American forces retreating through Kasserine Pass used those 4 hours to establish new defensive positions in the hills beyond. Artillery was brought forward. Anti-tank guns were sighted. Reinforcements arrived from reserve units. When Rommel's panzers finally broke through Marsh's delaying action and pushed into the pass itself, they met organized resistance instead of chaos. The battle raged for 2 more days. The Germans took the pass, but they could not exploit the breakthrough. The American line bent, but did not break. And on February 22nd, Rommel ordered a withdrawal. The offensive had stalled. Historians would later argue about why Rommel pulled back. Some said he overestimated American strength. Some said he received bad intelligence about British movements. Some said he simply ran out of fuel and ammunition. All of those factors mattered. But so did the 4 hours that Lieutenant Marsh's platoon bought on the morning of February 19th. 4 hours for chaos to become order. 4 hours for fear to become resolve. 4 hours purchased with buried bombs and the courage of men who refused to run. Marsh survived Kasserine. He survived the rest of the North African campaign. He survived Sicily and Italy. He was promoted twice and received a Silver Star for actions he never spoke about. After the war, he returned to Montana and worked as a structural engineer, building bridges instead of destroying tanks. He died in 1982. His obituary did not mention the minefield, but the Army's official history of the Tunisian campaign did. It called his action at Kasserine an example of effective improvisation under fire. It noted that his use of clustered mines, while unconventional, demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that American forces would need to develop if they were to compete with veteran German units. The German soldiers who faced those buried bombs at Kasserine had expected an easy fight. They had been told the Americans were inexperienced, afraid of casualties, unwilling to stand and fight when faced with superior tactics and equipment. What they found instead was a different kind of enemy, not more skilled, not better trained, but more unpredictable, more willing to gamble on untested ideas, more dangerous in their desperation. A captured German officer, interrogated after the battle, expressed frustration at what he called American disregard for proper military procedure. He said the clustered mines were excessive, that they violated the accepted principles of minefield design, that they were evidence of poor training rather than innovation. The American intelligence officer conducting the interrogation wrote in his report that the Germans seemed genuinely offended by the tactic, as if the Americans had cheated by not following the rules. But there were no rules. There was only survival. And the Americans were learning, faster than their enemies realized, that survival in modern war required constant adaptation. The textbook solutions did not always work. The approved tactics did not always apply. Sometimes the answer was to bury 3 mines where doctrine said to bury 1. Sometimes the answer was to ignore the manual and trust the judgment of a 25-year-old lieutenant with dirt under his fingernails and fear in his chest. This was the lesson of Kasserine. Not that the Americans won. They did not. Kasserine was a defeat, but it was a defeat that taught the survivors how to fight. It stripped away the illusions of easy victory. It forced American commanders to confront the gap between their army's material strength and its tactical skill. And it showed that even green troops, given the right leadership and the freedom to improvise, could inflict damage on the best soldiers in the world. The buried bombs became a symbol, not immediately, not in any official sense, but in the conversations of soldiers and in the after-action reports filed by officers who had witnessed what Marsh's platoon accomplished. The symbol was not of victory, but of resourcefulness, of the willingness to try something new when the old methods were not enough. The bombs represented American pragmatism, the ability to look at a problem and solve it with whatever tools were available, regardless of whether those tools were being used as their designers intended. This pragmatism was born from the American industrial experience. The United States in 1943 was the most productive nation on Earth. Its factories could outproduce any rival, but production alone did not win battles. It was the mindset behind the production that mattered, the idea that every problem had a solution, that every obstacle could be overcome through innovation and effort, that failure was not permanent, but only a step toward eventual success. The soldiers who carried this mindset to North Africa were not professional warriors. They were civilians in uniform, farmers and mechanics and students who had been handed rifles and told to fight. They did not have the parade ground discipline of the Germans. They did not have years of tactical training, but they had something else. They had the expectation that they could learn, that they could improve, that they could take a disaster like Kasserine and turn it into a classroom. Marsh's buried bombs were part of that classroom. They were an experiment conducted under fire. And like all good experiments, they generated data. They showed that clustered mines could destroy tanks. They showed that small units with limited resources could delay larger forces through intelligent use of terrain and explosives. They showed that American engineers, when given the freedom to act, could be as dangerous as American infantry or armor. The bombs also revealed something about the German army that would become increasingly important as the war progressed. The Wehrmacht was a superb fighting force, but it was also rigid. Its success in Poland and France had come from executing well-rehearsed plans with overwhelming speed and coordination. When those plans worked, the results were devastating. But when the plans encountered unexpected resistance or unfamiliar tactics, German commanders often struggled to adapt quickly. At Kasserine, Rommel's forces expected to break through American positions using conventional armored assault. When the minefield destroyed 3 tanks in rapid succession, the advance stalled while commanders reassessed. This hesitation, measured in minutes, cascaded into hours of delay. In a war of movement and timing, hours mattered. Rommel's window for exploiting his breakthrough at Kasserine was narrow. Every delay reduced his operational options, and by the time his forces finally pushed past Marsh's position, the window was already closing. The Americans learned from this. They learned that unpredictability was a weapon, that forcing the enemy to slow down and think was almost as valuable as destroying his equipment. They learned that defense was not just about holding ground, but about buying time for reinforcements, resupply, and reorganization. These lessons, paid for in blood at Kasserine, would be applied in Italy and France and Germany. They would become part of the American way of war. There is a museum in Tunisia now. It stands near the site of the Kasserine Pass battle. Inside are artifacts from both sides. German helmets and American canteens, photographs of the wounded and the dead, maps showing the advance and retreat. In one corner, preserved in a glass case, is a Mark the 78 anti-tank mine, British-made, rusted, deactivated decades ago. The placard beside it mentions that mines like this were used by American engineers to delay German armor during the battle. It does not mention Lieutenant Marsh. It does not describe the clustered burial technique. But the mine is there, a silent witness to what happened on that February morning. The mine represents more than a single battle. It represents the transformation of the American military from an uncertain, inexperienced force into the army that would eventually defeat Germany and Japan. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened in moments like Kasserine, where failure forced innovation and desperation produced creativity. It happened because men like Marsh refused to accept that being outmatched meant being beaten. After the war, the clustered mine tactic was analyzed and refined. It became part of standard combat engineer training. Variations were used in Korea and Vietnam. The principle remained the same. Concentrate explosive force at critical points to maximize psychological and physical impact. Use terrain and timing to multiply the effectiveness of limited resources. Trust the soldiers in the field to make decisions that doctrine could not anticipate. But the tactic's greatest value was not tactical. It was cultural. It reinforced the American military's growing belief that innovation mattered more than tradition, that a good idea from a lieutenant was worth more than a bad order from a general, that the army which learned fastest would ultimately prevail, regardless of who had the better equipment or more experienced soldiers at the start. This culture of innovation became America's true secret weapon. The Germans had better tanks in 1943. The Japanese had more experienced pilots. But the Americans had an institutional willingness to experiment, to fail, to learn, and to try again. They had officers who encouraged initiative rather than punishing deviation from doctrine. They had enlisted men who believed their opinions mattered, and their ideas might make a difference. And they had the industrial and intellectual resources to test new concepts rapidly and implement the ones that worked. The buried bombs at Kasserine were crude. They were dangerous to install. They were wasteful of resources. But they worked. And in war, working is all that matters. The bombs stopped tanks. They bought time. They saved lives. They proved that American soldiers, even in their first major defeat, could hurt the enemy, could slow the advance, could fight with courage and intelligence against the best army in the world. Lieutenant Daniel Marsh never claimed to be a hero. He said he was just doing his job, following orders, trying to buy 6 hours with whatever tools he had. But his job, that morning, was to stand between Rommel's panzers and the retreating American army. And he stood. He and 37 engineers with shovels and mines, and the stubborn refusal to quit. They stood long enough. That was their victory. Not the number of tanks destroyed or the ground held, but the time bought, the lives saved, the lesson learned. Today, the desert near Kasserine Pass is quiet. The wind blows sand over the roads where tanks once burned. The rocks where Marsh's men took cover are still there, unchanging and silent. Tourists visit the battlefield and imagine what it must have been like. They see the terrain and wonder how anyone could fight here, how anyone could survive. But the soldiers of 1943 did not have the luxury of wondering. They had orders. They had enemies. They had fear and duty and the desperate hope that they might live through the day. And they had the bombs, buried in sand, waiting in darkness, ready to erupt in fire and fury when the weight of war pressed down upon them. That is the truth of Kasserine. Not that America won, but that America learned. The buried bombs were the first lesson in a brutal education. They taught that defeat was not final, that innovation could emerge from desperation, that ordinary men, given the right tools and the freedom to think, could accomplish extraordinary things, and that the army which embraced these truths would not just survive the war, it would win it. The bombs are gone now. The mines were cleared or detonated decades ago. But the idea remains, buried deep in the institutional memory of the American military. The idea that there is always another way, always another solution, always another chance to turn the tide. You just have to be willing to dig deep enough to find it. If you want to hear more incredible stories of American heroes and untold moments from World War II, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.